What if everything you believed about your own life was a lie? What if the person who claimed to protect you was slowly erasing you? This is not a story about a crime. It's a story about a mind built inside a false reality. Tonight, we enter the space between truth and myth. This is the mind of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Here on Killer Mind, we don't tell crimes. We examine what happens before them. If you're drawn to human behavior, invisible failures, and minds no one understood in time, subscribe to the channel. Leave a like. It helps this kind of content keep existing. And comment below, what city are you watching from? From the moment Gypsy Rose was born, reality was not something she discovered. It was something handed to her, already decided. Before she could speak, before she could question, before she could compare her experience to anyone else's, her world had already been defined by another voice, a single authority, a single narrator, her mother. In most childhoods, identity forms through friction, through contradiction, curiosity, and correction. A child says, "This hurts," and someone responds, "That's normal," or "That's not." Reality is negotiated, tested. For Gypsy, there was no negotiation. Her body was described to her before she could feel it. Her limits were announced before she could challenge them. Her future was narrowed long before she could imagine one. Illness wasn't something she meant to understand. It was something she was told she was. Disease became identity, not a condition to overcome, not a diagnosis to question, but a permanent state of being. A story repeated so often that it hardened into truth, and repetition is one of the most powerful psychological tools that exists. When a child hears the same thing every day from the same voice, without contradiction, the brain doesn't label it as information. It labels it as reality. Doubt requires contrast. Gypsy had none. There were no doctors explaining things directly to her, no teachers pulling her aside, no peers comparing experiences. There was only her mother, interpreting the world, filtering every interaction, translating every sensation. Pain meant sickness, fatigue meant fragility, obedience meant safety, and safety in her world came at a price. Her mother wasn't just a caregiver. She was the sole source of truth, the gatekeeper between Gypsy and the outside world, the interpreter of her body, the narrator of her life story. That kind of dynamic doesn't just control behavior, it shapes perception. When a child depends entirely on one person for survival, that person becomes more than authority. They become reality itself. To question them feels less like rebellion and more like self-destruction. So Gypsy didn't question. She learned something else first. She learned to comply before she learned to think. Her environment rewarded passivity, silence, agreement. The less she asserted herself, the safer things felt. The more she trusted the narrative, the more approval she received. This wasn't accidental. Isolation wasn't a consequence of her condition. It was a method. The fewer external references she had, the easier it became to preserve the illusion. Without comparison, even the most extreme circumstances can feel normal, especially when they arrive slowly, especially when they're framed as love. And love was always present in the story Gypsy was told. "I'm doing this to protect you. I know what's best for you. You wouldn't survive without me." When those messages are delivered consistently, the mind adapts. It doesn't resist. It reorganizes itself around obedience. Doubt never had the chance to grow, because doubt requires space, and Gypsy's world had none. She wasn't taught to ask questions. She was taught to receive answers. She wasn't encouraged to listen to her body. She was instructed to mistrust it. Over time, lies don't feel like lies anymore. They feel like facts, and facts don't get challenged. By the time Gypsy reached adolescence, the boundaries between truth and fiction were no longer visible. The narrative had been internalized. Her identity had been constructed for her, layer by layer, year by year. She didn't feel trapped. She felt defined, and that distinction matters, because a trapped mind looks for escape, but a defined mind doesn't know anything else exists. Not yet. But reality, no matter how carefully controlled, has a weakness. It only takes one moment, one crack, for another version of the world to slip through. And when that happens, survival demands belief. For a long time, the question people ask is simple. Why didn't she resist? But that question assumes something Gypsy never had: the psychological freedom to imagine resistance as an option. By the time she was old enough to feel discomfort with her life, her mind had already learned a brutal lesson. Survival depended on belief, not belief in a religion or an idea, but belief in a single person's version of reality. In prolonged abuse, especially when it begins early, resistance doesn't disappear because the victim is weak. It disappears because the cost of resistance feels fatal. For Gypsy, love and fear occupied the same space. They weren't opposites, they were fused. The same hands that fed her, bathed her, and comforted her were also the hands that controlled, restricted, and defined her existence. That fusion is psychologically devastating. When care and control are delivered by the same person, the mind stops trying to separate them. It learns that safety only exists inside obedience. Questioning doesn't feel brave, it feels dangerous. And danger, in her world, had consequences, so she adapted. Humans are extraordinarily capable of adapting to almost anything, even prolonged harm, when adaptation feels like the only way to stay alive. Gypsy learned to read her mother's moods, anticipate expectations, and suppress internal conflict before it could surface. Pain became background noise, suffering became routine, and when something is routine, the mind stops labeling it as wrong. This is how abuse hides, not through constant terror, but through normalization. Gypsy wasn't counting injuries. She wasn't marking days of mistreatment. She was learning a rhythm, a system, a set of rules that kept life predictable. And predictability feels like safety, even when it hurts. Over time, her sense of autonomy didn't vanish all at once. It eroded quietly. Decisions were made for her, then explained to her, then eventually internalized by her. She stopped asking what she wanted. She started asking what was expected. Her body became something she didn't fully own. It was monitored, discussed, and managed by others. When your physical self is treated as fragile, defective, or dangerous, the mind begins to distance itself from it. The body becomes a prison, not because it can't move, but because it can't be trusted. And when you don't trust your body, you rely on someone else to interpret it for you. That dependence wasn't just practical, it was emotional. Her mother wasn't only a caretaker, she was a lifeline, the person who spoke for her, defended her, advocated for her. In Gypsy's mind, losing her mother didn't just mean losing protection. It meant losing existence. So silence became strategy, not silence born from ignorance, but silence born from calculation, the unspoken understanding that compliance kept the system intact. That questioning threatened collapse, and collapse meant chaos. And chaos, to someone raised in extreme control, is more frightening than suffering. This is where outsiders often misunderstand the psychology. They imagine a moment where Gypsy could simply say, "This isn't true," but to her mind, truth wasn't an objective thing. Truth was what kept her alive. Contradiction felt like betrayal, not of her mother, but of the only structure she knew. To reject the narrative meant stepping into an unknown with no tools, no allies, and no sense of self outside of illness. That's not freedom, that's annihilation. So belief became survival, even when parts of the story didn't quite fit, even when discomfort grew louder, even when confusion surfaced late at night, unspoken and unresolved. She didn't confront it, she absorbed it, because belief kept the world stable, and stability, even when painful, is seductive. But psychological systems built on denial have a flaw. They require constant reinforcement, and the moment reinforcement weakens, the moment another reality enters the frame, belief begins to strain, not break, strain. And strain is dangerous, because it creates pressure, and pressure eventually demands release. Gypsy didn't stop believing all at once. Instead, something far more unsettling happened. She discovered that other lives, other versions of reality, existed at all. And once the mind sees that, it can never fully unsee it. Doubt does not arrive like a revelation. It arrives quietly, almost politely. For Gypsy, it didn't begin with rebellion or anger. It began with exposure, the most dangerous thing a controlled reality can encounter, the outside world. For most people, the internet is noise, endless information easily ignored, but for someone raised inside a sealed psychological system, it becomes something else entirely, a window. Through a screen, Gypsy saw lives that didn't resemble her own. People her age walking freely, laughing, dating, making choices without asking permission, bodies that weren't treated as fragile objects, identities that weren't reduced to diagnoses. At first, it didn't feel like discovery. It felt like confusion, because confusion is what happens when two realities collide. She had been taught that she was incapable, dependent, permanently ill, and yet here were others, her peers, living without the constraints she had accepted as natural law. The mind doesn't reject a lifelong belief immediately, it compares, and comparison is where cracks begin to form. Gypsy didn't suddenly think, everything I was told is a lie. She thought something far more destabilizing. What if there's more? That question alone was dangerous, because it carried guilt. In her internal world, doubting the narrative felt like betraying the person who had sacrificed everything for her. Her mother's voice lived inside her, reminding her of danger, fragility, and consequence. So every moment of curiosity came with fear. Fear of punishment, fear of abandonment, fear of discovering that the only life she knew might not be real. This is the psychological cost of prolonged control. Even freedom feels threatening. As Gypsy explored more, the contradictions multiplied. Information clashed with instruction. Stories from others didn't match her own experience. And slowly, the narrative she had absorbed began to feel crowded. Two truths tried to occupy the same space. One said, "You are sick, you are dependent, you need protection." The other whispered, "You might not be." That whisper didn't bring relief. It brought terror. Because if the second truth was real, then the first wasn't just wrong. It was theft. It meant years lost, possibilities erased, a self that never had the chance to exist. And the mind resists that realization with everything it has. So Gypsy didn't confront it directly. She compartmentalized. A public self that complied, believed, and obeyed. And a private self, online, unseen, that experimented with identity, with agency, with being someone else, even briefly. This split wasn't rebellion, it was survival. When a person cannot safely integrate doubt into their real life, they isolate it, they hide it. They let it live in secret spaces where consequences feel distant. But secrecy has its own cost. It intensifies emotion. Every forbidden interaction felt amplified. Every glimpse of normalcy felt intoxicating, not because it was extreme, but because it was forbidden. And forbidden things take on power far beyond their actual substance. Gypsy didn't just want freedom, she idealized it. Freedom became absolute, total, untouched by complication, a place without fear, without control, without punishment. That kind of thinking isn't childish, it's the result of deprivation. When someone is denied something for too long, they stop imagining it realistically. They imagine it as salvation. At the same time, fear never left. Questioning the narrative meant risking everything she had: shelter, care, identity. It meant stepping into a world where she had no skills, no protection, and no experience being autonomous. So her mind oscillated. Hope, guilt, curiosity, panic, over and over. This wasn't a clean awakening. It was psychological whiplash. And the longer it continued, the harder it became to maintain both realities at once. The tension demanded resolution, not necessarily truth, but relief. Something had to give. Because a mind cannot live indefinitely inside contradiction. Eventually, It chooses a path, not the healthiest one, but the one that feels possible. As Gypsy's internal world fractured, her thinking began to change. Options narrowed, nuance disappeared, and when the mind is pushed into a corner long enough, it stops looking for normal solutions. When a mind is raised inside extremes, it learns to think in extremes. By the time Gypsy reached the point where doubt could no longer be contained, her internal world had already narrowed into a brutal equation: safety or annihilation, obedience or disappearance. There was no space in between. This is the danger of prolonged psychological confinement. It doesn't just limit freedom, it limits imagination. Normal solutions require the ability to envision gradual change, negotiation, external help. But those concepts had never been modeled for her, so her mind didn't reach for them. Instead, her thinking became binary: escape or cease to exist. The idea of slow freedom, of explanation, exposure, rescue, felt unrealistic, even impossible. It assumed a world that listened, a system that protected, adults who would believe. Her lived experience had taught her the opposite. Authority didn't rescue her. Authority reinforced the narrative. Every institution she encountered confirmed the story she had been given. Doctors, charities, strangers, all of them echoed the same message. Her mother was devoted, selfless, heroic. That collective validation didn't just silence Gypsy. It taught her that truth, if spoken, would be overwritten. So the mind adapted again. When external reality refuses to accommodate complexity, the internal world grows more intense. Fantasies don't emerge because someone is delusional. They emerge because reality feels unreachable. In Gypsy's mind, freedom was no longer a process. It was an event, a single decisive rupture that would end one life and begin another. Clean, absolute, final. This is not how healthy minds approach change, but this was not a healthy structure. As pressure increased, dissociation followed. Emotional distance became necessary. Feelings that were too dangerous to hold consciously were pushed aside. Fear dulled, guilt blurred, consequences became abstract. Dissociation isn't the absence of emotion, it's the narrowing of it. The world becomes simplified, reduced to what must be done, not what it means. Responsibility, too, began to shift. When someone is denied agency for long enough, they don't suddenly know how to wield it responsibly. They seek someone else to carry the weight, to act, to decide. Not because they want control, but because control feels foreign. And so, agency was outsourced. The mind told itself a story where freedom would arrive through another's actions, where responsibility could be divided, where choice felt less like a burden. This isn't manipulation in the way people imagine it. It's displacement, a coping mechanism for a mind that has never been allowed to decide without punishment. As plans took shape, Gypsy's thinking became strangely calm. That calm is often misunderstood. People expect panic before irreversible decisions, but panic happens earlier, during uncertainty. Once the mind commits to a path, especially one framed as survival, clarity can replace fear, not peace. Clarity. The idea of freedom became almost sacred, untouchable, perfect. It wasn't imagined with details, bills, jobs, loneliness, only with absence. No control, no fear, no voice defining her. That kind of idealization is dangerous because it erases consequence. It transforms action into necessity. It reframes harm as escape. And somewhere in that reframing, an invisible line was crossed. Not the line between right and wrong, but the line between possibility and inevitability. Once the mind decides there is only one way forward, alternatives cease to exist. Moral reasoning collapses under perceived necessity. The future shrinks to a single outcome. And when that happens, the mind is no longer asking, "Should I?" It is asking, "When?" That's the most dangerous moment, not because of violence, but because of certainty. Certainty that there is no other door, no other voice, no other life. And when the act finally occurred, it wasn't experienced as chaos, it was experienced as release. But release doesn't erase consequence. It only delays awareness, because after the rupture, after the moment that cannot be undone, the world returns. And it does not see process. It sees outcome. When the story finally became public, it wasn't told as a construction. It was told as a verdict, and the space between truth and myth closed quickly. Once the crime was revealed, the world rushed in, not with curiosity, but with conclusions. Stories like this make people uncomfortable because they refuse to stay in clean categories. And when society feels discomfort, it does what it always does. It simplifies. Victim or villain, monster or innocent, manipulator or manipulated. The public narrative demanded clarity. It demanded a single role for Gypsy to occupy. And slowly, the complexity of her psychological construction was flattened into something easier to consume. The media didn't ask how a mind like this was built. It asked who to blame. Trauma became content. Interviews became performances. Context was trimmed to fit headlines. A lifetime of psychological conditioning was compressed into sound bites. And in that compression, something essential was lost. Because the justice system is designed to respond to actions, not origins. It measures behavior, not the architecture of the mind that produced it. Abuse that leaves bruises is easier to process than abuse that reshapes identity. Psychological control doesn't leave fingerprints. It leaves distortions. In court, the question wasn't, what kind of mind was created here? It was who is responsible, and responsibility, while necessary, is a blunt tool. It struggles with gray areas. It resists acknowledging that two things can be true at once. That harm can be caused by someone who was deeply harmed. That agency can exist inside severe limitation. That guilt does not erase victimhood, so the public split. Some saw Gypsy as a helpless child, frozen in time. Others saw her as calculating, deceptive, complicit. Both perspectives missed something vital. They focused on the ending, not the construction. Because if we truly examined the process, the years of isolation, repetition, identity erasure, and institutional failure, we'd be forced to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions about how easily narratives are accepted, about how often control disguises itself as devotion, about how many systems validated a story without ever questioning the cost to the person living inside it. The question, was she guilty or innocent, feels important, but it's the wrong one. The more unsettling question is this: how did so many people look at the same child and never see the mind being dismantled? For years, warning signs existed, but they didn't look dramatic. They looked like caregiving, like sacrifice, like devotion. And those are the hardest masks to question, because questioning them threatens something deeper than a single case. It threatens the belief that harm is always obvious, that danger always looks dangerous, that victims always resist. Gypsy's story refuses that comfort. It shows us a reality where abuse is quiet, where compliance is mistaken for consent, where survival strategies are later judged as intent. And once the crime occurred, the story froze in that moment. Everything before it became backstory. Everything after it became debate. But the mind that lived in between, the one shaped slowly, silently, and invisibly, was never truly understood. Not by the public, not by the system, and perhaps not even by Gypsy herself at first, because when someone is raised inside a false reality, escaping it doesn't automatically grant clarity. It grants confusion. Freedom doesn't arrive as healing. It arrives as disorientation. And that may be the most lasting consequence of all. Not prison, not judgment, but the lifelong task of untangling who you are from who you were told to be. Stories like this disturb us because they refuse to give us easy answers. They deny us the comfort of clear villains and perfect victims. They resist the clean moral lines we rely on to feel safe in our judgments. And so, we argue about outcomes. We debate guilt. We choose sides. But all of that keeps us from looking at what truly matters: the process. Because long before a crime ever occurred, a mind was being shaped. Not violently, not suddenly, but methodically. The mind does not begin broken. It is molded silently, by repetition that replaces doubt, by isolation that removes comparison, by love that carries conditions, by authority that never allows contradiction. What happened in this story did not begin with a decision. It began with a childhood where reality was dictated instead of discovered, where obedience was rewarded more than curiosity, where survival required belief. And when that belief finally fractured, it didn't fracture cleanly. It shattered, because a mind that has never been allowed to leave gradually doesn't know how to escape safely. It doesn't imagine nuance. It imagines absolutes, freedom or nothing. That is the cost of invisible damage. By the time the world noticed, it was already too late to intervene gently. The moment had passed. The construction was complete, and when the mind finally tried to escape, the world only saw the rupture, not the years of pressure behind it. Between the truth and the myth lives something far more unsettling than a verdict. A mind no one knew how to protect. A mind built inside a story that should have been questioned, but never was. And perhaps the most uncomfortable realization of all is that stories like this don't feel rare. They feel familiar, because they force us to confront a truth we'd rather avoid. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives disguised as devotion. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it smiles. And sometimes we don't notice it at all until it's far too late. If this story made you uncomfortable, it did its job. Here on Killer Mind, we don't look away from complexity. We examine it. Subscribe for more psychological deep dives into the minds built before the crime. Leave a comment with your thoughts, or tell us what case we should explore next. And remember, between truth and myth, there is always a mind.